As a startup, as a scale up, you often get one chance. That first impression is often the only impression. If first impression is something that's slow, doesn't work, is down entirely, people move on. People go find a competitor. People will go find some other way to solve that problem. The biggest warning signs that we really look at are really that breakdown of that shared goal, right? That finger pointing and saying, well, engineering didn't do this, well, product didn't do this. Well, I mean, I don't know. When you're a scale up, like it doesn't matter who didn't do it. You didn't do it, and you're going to go out of business if you don't succeed. So that's not really helpful patterns, but it's really common.
As a startup, you're experimenting, right? What's the quickest way or the leanest way that I can experiment with it? And that only comes through negotiation between product and engineering. And it's interesting, but we're not saying that product engineering should get along all the time. One of the important things to remember is you're going to fail.
Yep.
Like over and over and over again. So the important thing is like this sort of like having this healthy transparency.
One of the things that kind of I think happens a lot, that we see a lot, is where engineering ends up with their own goals, right? The engineering is trying to say, we're focused on scalability, we're focused on tech debt, we're focused on uptime, we're focused on whatever, right?
Often I've seen the non-functional, cross-functional used as an excuse for engineers to build their most fanciful systems.
Hello guys, welcome to the Tech Regional podcast. Today I have with me Team Cochran and Kennedy Collins. Both are some of the co-authors of this series called Bottlenecks of a Scaleup, right? Published on Martin Fowler. And I believe when they wrote it, they were in ThoughtWorks, although now probably it's a little bit different. But I think I find these articles really, really insightful, especially for those of you who are going through this journey. You know, working in scale-ups, there are so many challenges, there are so many things that you have to take care of. So welcome to the show, Tim and Kennedy.
Thank you.
Hi.
So maybe before we start with all the discussions about the bottlenecks, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit and maybe share us highlights or turning points that you think we all can learn from you.
Sure. I can go first. Kennedy Collins, based in Chicago, a product manager by trade, I guess, although my background is in architecture. I studied buildings. But yeah, in terms of how I kind of ended up in this space and this topic, I graduated university into kind of right after the financial crisis of 2008, which led to a really bad time to build buildings, right? And so I had been doing various bits of marketing work and various kind of marketing and design things here and there since I was like in high school, just kind of working here and there. And so I ended up getting a job with a startup here in Chicago because it was a bad time to do buildings, and grew that into a product management role. And then spent about 5 years or a little bit more working in startups in Chicago. And then from there, I joined ThoughtWorks. And it was a very interesting transition because I had been in startups, including one that I started myself, for my entire career at that point, pretty much. And then not only was ThoughtWorks the biggest company I ever worked for, I was, my first client was bigger than ThoughtWorks, the biggest company I ever worked for. But actually the ThoughtWorks team on that client was about the same size as the largest company I'd ever worked for. So it was a big transition. And then from there, I ended up spending a number of years working in some of our public sector clients, including for the Department of Veterans Affairs, which is literally the largest federal government agency. So I went from this tiny company thing to this giant company thing. Now I bounced around a little bit inside of ThoughtWorks as well, but I'm currently leading our product design and development practice for North America. That's me.
So I worked for ThoughtWorks for 19 years. I think my career major highlight was before ThoughtWorks, I worked in a company that was exploring Agile, and I think, bought a book by Ken Beck, Extreme Programming and Refactoring, the Design Patterns book. And I think that led me down the route of researching and then applying to ThoughtWorks and getting in. And it was a great company to learn your craft as a developer. During that time, lots of innovation coming out of the company. And how I ended up working with Scaleups is, so I was working in the East market, and the nature of some of ThoughtWorks' principles like open source and diversity and things like that led us to work with a number of scale-ups, or more like scaled digital companies. So companies like Spotify and Etsy. The thing with ThoughtWorks is you never get a project. They don't call you if everything's going well. So it's always a problem. So we got called into a few like scale companies that were scaling or scale-ups that had a massive bottleneck. And then at the same time, I was also working at enterprises, right? So it led me down this route of sort of comparing all these things of like these scaled digital natives, these enterprises that were struggling to modernize, and then these companies that were really bottlenecked. And so that got me interested, and I petitioned to sort of run a studio at ThoughtWorks. And it led to a lot of research and a lot of talking to people. At ThoughtWorks, we have tons of different backgrounds and people that had worked in different areas. And so doing a lot of research with people like Kennedy to try to create these articles and work together on projects. Like all the articles were based on real world experience.
Thanks for sharing some of your journey, right? So I think definitely when we talk about scale ups, right, there's so many challenges. But before we go through that, maybe if you can level set what is scale up, right? And at which point of a startup journey that you can call yourself scale up, I think that will be great for the listeners.
Sure. I think we probably each have our own slightly different definitions, but the way that I think about this is like, it's one way to think about it is kind of post product market fit. But I think the other way to think about it is kind of through the lens of these problems and these scaling challenges that we're talking about, right? And having worked in a number of startups, the problem that you face is that no one cares and no one cares and no one cares. And the thing that you're really facing is awareness and getting those users and getting people to actually use your product. And then one day you have the opposite problem if you're successful, if you are so lucky. And then everyone is trying to come in all at once and everyone is trying to use your things and you don't have enough time to keep up or do anything. I think about this for a company that I worked at, right? We were as a media company and we launched a new product, we launched a new website, and we had 10,000 users, 20,000 users, 30,000 users, 100,000 users, 10 million users, 40 million users. That's monthly numbers. And it just like went, and then everything started melting all the time. And then also it became really, really hard from a product perspective. And also we raised $25 million Series B at that point, which also led to a bunch of other issues because now we have, as opposed to operating from this place of scarcity, we're operating from this place of surplus, and how do we make good choices? And so it's that transition, that post that transition, which is one of the reasons why we wanted to write these articles and why I was really excited when I found out Tim was doing it, because it is such a dramatic mindset shift from in that early kind of scaling portion that it's challenging. And I think it's a hard place to navigate. I don't know. Would you agree with that, Tim?
Yeah, I do. And I think, a lot of folks obviously think about hypergrowth and it's the desired state, I think. But I think also like there could be companies that are just growth, not necessarily hypergrowth. Like ThoughtWorks is a good example of that. Like we had our own scaling problems, but I don't think it was hypergrowth. So it's interesting. But as Kennedy says, that sort of post product market fit. And we really wanted to think about like, what are some of those foundational problems that you can solve, that you should put in at the beginning, but it's very hard to find because we also experienced a number of scale-ups where they had a problem because they'd over-engineered or over-invested at the beginning before they had product market fit. So it's this incredibly hard balance of what things you should put in place that you won't regret.
Yeah, I think it's always challenging, right? So as a startup, you want to get the product market fit. So you build as much as you can, right, to get the product market fit. But sometimes when you're successful, right, you kind of like lose the balance a bit. And like what Kennedy said, somehow there's a point in time where it just flipped. All these concerns suddenly becomes more important. So in the series, there are 6 bottlenecks that are identified for scale-ups. Probably we won't be able to cover all of them, but let's just start with some of those things that I find really interesting based on my experience as well working in the scale-up. The first one is about friction between product and engineering. I think we can see it not just in scale-up, right?
Oh, yes.
In many organizations, sometimes this becomes a friction. Maybe we'll try to cover by covering what are the warning signs, how can people identify if there are major frictions, and what are some solutions. So maybe let's start with the product and engineering friction.
This is the one that I wrote, and I helped edit some of the other ones and that kind of stuff. But this is the one that I was one of the 2 main co-authors on. So yeah, I can start talking about this. This is really something that we started talking about because we do see it in a lot of our larger companies, right? Although the solution is often slightly different and the cause is usually quite different, right? And that's sort of why we wanted to tackle this, is because, well, the solutions are often very common, but the cause is usually quite different. It's worth talking about because in these larger companies, oftentimes you get this disconnect because of large bureaucratic organizations and organizations that build up all these systems and processes where folks don't talk to each other, and organizations that get caught up in the expectations of their funders and their capital oftentimes as well, right? Public companies wanting predictability, turning a lot of software development into something about time and about budget rather than about outcome and about results. But That's not really why this happens in Scaleups. This happens in Scaleups in our experience because people were successful, right? You had a core team. You had, if it's me and Tim starting a company, we had product and engineering, and there was no issues with communication because I just talked to Tim. And it's this fundamental thing that happens when you start to grow, and especially when you start to add new people into the organization, where you don't build out those systems to allow for both collaboration and allow for autonomous teams, allow for kind of success, right? And without that, you end up in this place where the principals, people who started the organization, are still the bottlenecks constantly for product decisions, engineering decisions, and the people within the organizations aren't aligned, aren't working together, aren't working as teams, and that causes a lot of issues. So that was kind of the thing that we identified as why this would be interesting to talk about specifically for Scaleup and how to solve it. Yeah, the biggest warning signs that we really look at are really that breakdown of that shared goal, right? That finger pointing and saying, well, engineering didn't do this, well, product didn't do this. Well, I mean, I don't know. When you're a scale up, like, it doesn't matter who didn't do it. You didn't do it, and you're going to go out of business if you don't succeed. So that's not really helpful patterns, but it's really common. The other side of that, too, is oftentimes missed dependencies from a timing perspective. People understand that they rely on each other's work, which again goes to this idea of going from one team to multiple teams. This idea of engineers not having enough understanding of the goal and the product to be able to make autonomous decisions, be able to move autonomously, right? And with engineers and also kind of product folks at the team level, not knowing enough about where they're going and the strategy and the goals to work autonomously and to have things, again, continue to be bottlenecked through the original founders. And then also this thing that Tim brought up a minute ago that I think is really interesting to talk about, which is this negotiation between tech debt and this negotiation between infrastructure improvements and technical investment and product and feature and things that ostensibly are adding new features and functionality and bringing new people in, right? Because like we were talking about a minute ago, and I'd love for Tim to talk about this a little more because he's much more articulate about it than I am. There's this moment where everything, where you run into these scaling problems, right? And you need to invest in the technology, you haven't enough. Or the inverse, like Tim said, you've baked in a lot of assumptions about your product into the system, and now you're living with that and you're struggling with that. And this conversation about how you make those investments and how you make really smart strategic decisions about what you're going to let live and what you need to invest in so that you can continue to grow. It's a conversation that needs to happen as a negotiation of equals. And when that can't happen, then things really start to break down.
Yeah, I mean, it's important, right? Like as a startup, you're experimenting, right? And the only way you're going to be able to experiment efficiently is that balance of a product idea and then what's the quickest way that the leanest way that I can experiment with it? And that only comes through negotiation between product and engineering. And it's interesting, but we're not saying that product engineering should get along all the time. In actual fact,
There's
it
a healthy
should be
tension there.
Yeah, a tension, right? A push and a pull, in a good way, right? Because ultimately products will want the feature out as fast as possible, and engineering should push back on the quality, the observability, the availability, right? Where appropriate.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest disconnect as well that I can see, right, as both organizations grow, they kind of like focus on their functional silo most of the times, right? And people have different priorities. Maybe sometimes as they get larger, right? Kennedy mentioned about bureaucracy and process. So things probably starting to get slower and there's a lot of bureaucracy. And I think there are a lot of cases as well where sometimes engineering doesn't understand why the product wants it a certain way. And also the other
Absolutely.
way, right? Product doesn't understand why engineering thinks some of the things are important. So maybe if you can give us some pointers, like what are some of the solutions that you can propose for us to have lesser friction? Some frictions is good, right? Just like Tim mentioned. But how can we have the healthy friction or healthy tension?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one of the important things to remember is you're going to fail.
Yep.
Like over and over and over again. So the important thing is like this sort of like having this healthy transparency and this kind of like blameless ability to do blameless postmortems and to really think about things objectively. Because if you get to that area where you're siloed, you have protectionism, as a startup, it won't work because you have to be a Teflon. You have to look at things objectively and understand, no finger pointing and that kind of stuff. So, I mean, one of the big things we see a lot is this. I run into this a lot because we go to a lot of organizations and we talk about cross-functional teams. Everyone's like, oh, we're cross-functional. And what probably that meant in some places is they're just kind of like the floor plan. they just sat teams next to each other, but they weren't actually like communicating or like actually working together. It was still like a handover, a document handover, and not like, are you actually discussing and brainstorming and literally just pairing and working together? Yeah. So I think, not to an anti-pattern, but the positive thing is just to try to, and that kind of requires a lot of work, right? To build that vulnerability of like actually creating and retrospecting together. So building that sort of vulnerability, forming that team at sort of higher levels.
Yeah, we love retrospectives for that in particular, right? I used to joke, I still do actually, that in terms of like agile ceremonies or whatever, people talk about like big A agile and you have to do all this stuff. The retrospective is the only thing that's required. Everything else is optional. There are some good places to start, but the only thing you really need to do is sit down, make sure you do is sit down, talk to each other about how it's going and what you can do together to change and improve. Everything else you can throw out. That's the only thing that has to happen, in my opinion. And you can negotiate and figure out the best way of working for you and your team and your goals, which takes me to the other big thing that we talk about a lot, right? Which is goals. One of the things that kind of, I think, happens a lot, that we see a lot, is where engineering ends up with their own goals, right? The engineering is trying to say, we're focused on scalability, we're focused on tech debt, we're focused on uptime, we're focused on whatever, right? And product is saying, we're focused on shipping new features, we're focused on achieving product market fit, we're focused on bringing in a new persona into our product, whatever, right? All those goals are fine and reasonable a lot of the time, but they're ultimately goals that are designed to further the success of the scale up, for the success of the organization, right? And if you're not talking together and setting and making both of those goals everybody's goals, and both thinking the business value of things like scalability, which there is a lot of, don't get me wrong, and talking about it through that lens, and at the same time comparing that as much as you can, apples to apples, and you can't always, but trying to kind of have a conversation about those things and say, okay, do we need to focus this month, this week, this quarter on 5 nines of uptime or getting a new persona in? Those are really different questions, but they do ultimately impact your success as an organization. And so getting really clear and having that conversation together around what's important and how we're going to create that value is really important. The other big thing that we think about a lot too, and this doesn't, I'm going to say this, but this doesn't have to be heavyweight, right? Is just making sure everyone understands how your organization creates value. Every scale up, at least commercial ones, are trying to provide a service for people, provide a product or a service for people at a cost to them that is lower than they charge the people, and therefore make a profit. And that value, there's a very clear understanding of what value are you providing to your customer, and what value can you capture back in the form of usually revenue if it's a direct SaaS business, or whenever it's media, then the value we'd get is people looking, and then we'd sell that to advertisers, and then, that's the value loop. But making sure everyone understands that core business, really the business that you're in, the exchange of value and what you're providing to society and the value you're getting back from them in order to kind of continue providing that value, and then how their team contributes to that. If people understand that, then it's really hard to have these conversations, right? And the inverse is, once people start to understand that, in our experience anyway, they'll come up with great ideas actually around, hey, I think we could do a better job. Or, for example, I think we do a better job getting this value if we do this or that or the other thing, creating this value, ensuring that we create this value for folks. So yeah, those are some of the key things. It sounds a bit vague. One of the things you mentioned in the article too is there's a book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team by Patrick Lencioni. It's a good book. We like it a lot. I like it a lot. And I think it's a good starting point just to talk about psychological safety, like Tim said, and like finding that place where that team can really, really collaborate. And then you get into autonomous teams and structure and stuff, but we can get into that some other time. That's a longer discussion.
Right. I think there are so many insightful things, right? I must admit as well, last time when I worked in a scale-up, right? So we used to have the engineering roadmap, so-called engineering initiative, right? And also the product initiative. Like sometimes they can be totally independent, right? And I think all this blameless thing is definitely very important, right? We want to have like no finger pointings or, blaming why certain things are done this way. But I think if I can pick one particular thing that if you can give us more suggestion is how to come up with a unified roadmap, right? Because sometimes it comes from the top, the CEO just said, oh, yeah, we want to increase revenue, increase users. And that gets translated usually with more features. Yeah. How do you get this mixed balance of product and engineering priorities?
So I think that comes back to this idea of fundamentally understanding the business you're in and what you're doing, right? And when I say that, I mean like every organization, ultimately, every result an organization has is just human behavior, including often the most important human behavior that we care about as a business, which is people giving us money. But it's all just human behavior, right? And it's all just aggregate human behavior. Every metric you look at is just human behavior in aggregate. or it's system behavior that was programmed by humans or whatever, right? It affects human behavior at the end of the day. And thinking about really, and to your point, right? Like it's just to rag on my own side of the house for a little bit, right? People saying we want more users. Great, man. It doesn't matter. Like I want a lot of things. It doesn't help. What's your theory for what you can provide to those users to get them in the door, right? It's having that really clear understanding of that value loop or that hypothesis. We get into hypotheses, right? But hypothesis is not this idea of, well, if we do this, then we will get more users. More users is not the output of the hypothesis. The output of the hypothesis is if we build this feature, then more people will show up every day because they want that value, right? It's a slight difference, but it's important. Anyway, point being, what behaviors are you supporting? What behaviors are people paying you to support? And then I find that when you have that, it makes it much easier to have this, this idea of unified roadmap, at least to have these high-level hypotheses where you can have from the top down, from the CEO, from the CTO, from whomever. And oftentimes in my experience, there's a healthy balance between the two, right? Where oftentimes you're seeing this idea from leadership of pushing into adjacent areas, pushing into new products, new extensions, new markets. And then where you do expect the teams say, hey, we should try and target, we think our product would be good for this other persona we don't really target right now. If we did some stuff, let's go dig into that. But you also don't need to provide more detail than that, although you can, right? Team ownership of that too. And then at the team level, teams kind of saying, hey, we think that we can improve our chunk of this if we do this, right? And finding the right balance between those two, again, is a conversation between leadership and the teams, and it's a conversation between product engineering to also say, these technology initiatives, this goes to kind of one of the next things that one of the other articles that we wrote, which is about service disruptions, right? Service disruptions are hugely painful for Scaleups. And a lot of that has to do with not thinking about the fact that 5 nines is not just a technical idea. It really means that people can't get the value they're trying to get from your product for many days or weeks or hours or whatever, depending on how many nines you got. And having that conversation through that lens of, well, how does this enable us? Or, and if the answer is that you're working on developer tooling to get the second order effect of being able to help our customers in an abstract way more quickly, that's also part of it, but understand how it ties back to what you're doing as a business. And that ultimately gives you a common language to negotiate with or to collaborate with and to find that space.
Yeah, I find that the gist is always like understanding the business value, right? Understanding how the organizations can actually move the needle, right? Instead of, just focusing on the functional aspect of each of the team, right? You just mentioned about service disruption. Maybe let's go to that bottleneck, right? I also find that a lot of scale-ups will have this challenge. For example, downtime or the system throws a lot of errors, right? Users complaining. There could be various other things, right? But tell us why this bottleneck is also so important for us to think about.
Why? Because this is what really hurts when you get to hypergrowth and you haven't put the fundamental systems in place. I worked in the crypto space for a little bit. And when certain tweets went out, the systems all used to come down and losing millions of dollars because they had designed it in not a great way, right? So it's interesting. Like, I think service disruption is like, there's a lot of stuff that we're quite pragmatic about, but I think almost like availability, it's easier. It's almost a non-negotiable. Of course, there's a spectrum to it, but I think it's a lot easier to just from the beginning to build those habits and practices in rather than trying to do it once you've scaled. It's sort of a nightmare. So if you start to build it in a way that you are thinking about, I think we have to be a little bit careful about scalability, but scalability in a simple way, not in a complex way. But if you're thinking about those things and high quality code and those kind of things, but it'll take your business down, right? Like, because at the moment when you've gone viral, your product's caught up, and then your customer service is disrupted.
And one of the things that I think about a lot, right, is as a startup, as a scale up, you often get one chance or two, or you maybe get another one in 5 years if you stick around that long, right? But that first impression is often the only impression. If first impression is something that's slow, doesn't work, is down entirely, people move on. People go find a competitor. People will go find some other way to solve that problem. And I think the other thing to think about too, right, is like, that's an interesting one, I think, because if you think about, let's say you have, 4 nines of 3 9, I'm all about nines today. Say you have 3 nines of availability. Tim, how much downtime is that over the course of like a month? It's a day or more, right? Like a month? No, over a quarter, it's a day, I think, something like that. Point being, you might say, that's only 0.01% of users who are going to see that. Those 0.01 is never coming back, right? It doesn't matter. Risk actually is a function of both odds and impact. And stuff that is low odds but really, really high impact, you should work to avoid. It's critical, right? And to Tim's point, it's one of those things that, at least in our experience, is not that hard to just make different decisions every day to build it in. It's not like it's this thing where it's this heroic effort. You have to invest a lot. It's a lot of little decisions you make every day as you're building software that allow you to have software that's instrumented and scalable and that kind of thing, right? Whereas it becomes a Herculean effort later if you try and do it. And it's even more expensive usually. And so it's one of those things, like Tim said, it's always these trade-offs we think about, but it's one of the things that is really worth trying to build in from day one, because ultimately you're trying to get to that growth, ultimately trying to get to that scale and resilience and monitoring and understanding, how to do this, obviously in a reasonable way, not gold plating anything, is really worth your time. I'm curious, Tim, is there anything else you would put on that list of like non-negotiables? I have a thought, but I want to hear yours first.
I mean, certainly it's in the realm of service disruption, but monitoring, observability, and monitoring not just at an infrastructure level, but at a business metric and a product metric level, I think is because it's kind of like, otherwise you're in the dark, right? Because you're doing experiments, but I have no data to come off. So I think that sort of experimentation infrastructure is for a scale up is important. And then, I work for ThoughtWorks, right? So I have to say testing.
That was going to be mine, actually. We're big fans of TDD and big fans of kind of how all that stuff works.
Yeah.
As evidenced by the fact that a product person understands TDD quite well. At ThoughtWorks anyway. But this idea of test-driven development, or even this, basically for me, I think about it as a scale up, you will have to change the software a lot, right? If it's not a one-off throwaway experiment that you're just trying to see what happens that you're going to toss and kind of rebuild later, having good testing, good automated testing around that is really critical to enable that ability to change safely, that ability to tweak, that ability to experiment, that ability to evolve your product. If not, you end up in this place that we see so often where you hit that hyperscale and then the first thing you have to do is a massive rewrite of your core platform, and then you're not shipping any new features for 6 months or a year, and then you get lapped by your competitors. We see it a lot, actually. And it's really, really rough. And if you build in that ability to change through testing from day one, it really kind of makes that evolvability possible.
Yeah, thanks for those tips, right? I would just add one more, which is try to build a robust continuous delivery, because like what you said, right? You will introduce a lot of change. So if you can deliver those changes fast, I think that will be great as well. Another thing that I find for service disruptions, right? Most people actually find it's related to the non-functional aspect of your software, not really necessarily the functional. And hence, again, coming back to our first bottleneck, right? Sometimes it is deemed as engineering problem. All these service disruptions, probably for engineers to solve. Again, I think this is not healthy, right? How can the product also take accountability on such service disruptions and maybe come up with, again, like a unified roadmap to actually tackle this together?
We don't like the term I don't like the term, ThoughtWorks tends to not use the term non-functional requirements. We use the term cross-functional requirements a lot, right? Because it's really this space of, it cuts across different specific pieces of functionality, but it is critical to the ultimate success of the product, right? And one of the things Tim and I haven't talked in a little bit, and one of the things that I've been on about lately is product people participating, kind of the setting of SLAs or SLOs, right? Because oftentimes, you ask engineering is like, well, what should the SLA be? And they just guess. They go, I don't know, like it needs to be up a lot, or most of the time, 5 nines, 6 nines. Right now, I'm working on a commercial, I'm working with a client, not a scale-up, but they run auctions, right? Those auctions happen in a set period of time. So we need to have 5, really, really high availability in a known scheduled period of time. And then it does not matter the rest of the time. And that's a different consideration, right? Similarly, like in some parts of that, with auctions, bidding and response times with bidding need to be really, really fast. Response times after you win, response times for taking a payment can be a bit slower, especially, and this is funny, this is the thing we talked about in this auction business, just for example, response times for taking a payment in the auction business are actually not as important as they are in e-commerce, in my opinion. And this is what we've talked about from SLA perspective, because if you've won the auction, you're already legally obligated to pay for it. If you have some downtime, if it's slow, people come back because they are legally obligated to do so. Whereas in e-commerce, there's friction that's introduced by bad payment gateways and bad payment structure, where you really want to have that high availability and really, really quick, right? And so talking with that, and product should be part of that conversation, because thinking about the customer impact and the relative risk of downtime and the relative risk of service disruptions is important. This goes back to this idea that like risk is a function of both impact and odds, right? And if it's low odds but really high impact, that's one thing. If it's something that's like really low impact, it doesn't matter that much, right? And invest where it's important. And that goes back to this idea of investing where it's important, investing where it's really going to impact your business.
Often I've seen the non-functional, cross-functional used as an excuse for engineers to build the most fanciful systems, right? Like, because it has to be like absolutely real time or something, and they want some sort of event-sourced, event-driven system, and because they want it to. And they're just trying to justify it. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of like pragmatism that I think is important. And it's from both sides, right? Because I think probably what you're talking about is like sometimes like a developer will ask a product manager, it's like, should it be real time? And they probably just go, yes.
That sounds great.
Unless they've actually understood it properly. Like, what is that trade-off? Like, you know, we're probably talking like millions of dollars decision right there and then, right? And, you know, in real time, there's such a difference.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, like, you know, I think you told me this, Tim. It's like, because I was asking you about like the relative investment of uptime. And you're like, every 9 is another order of magnitude more expensive. And like, so what does it need to be?
The thing I was going to say about this, which is sort of interesting, is this tax can be hidden quite a lot, especially with scale-ups, because what can happen is you often have a core team and they may, unless you've got a good product management system, they may be just doing a lot of work to keep the system up and you may not know because they're sort of, we see this quite a lot, like the core team, they build it, they can solve problems really quickly. And perhaps they don't need to build automations at the beginning because they can just solve it. But the problem is like over time, those issues increase. And then if someone's asking, well, why are we not building features fast enough? And it's actually because a lot of the team there's a lot of tax on the team. And often it's just not known because it doesn't show up in the product management system.
You don't see that unplanned work. You talk about how fast the planned work is happening, but you don't talk about what's happening with the unplanned work and the volume of that unplanned work, right? And I mean, this goes to your point, Tim. It's like a lot of that is just not lying to yourself. Like, I know that sounds simple, but it's like being honest with yourself. And this goes back to this thing we talked about, kind of blameless cultures and retrospectives and really talking about what's going on in a blameless way. Because if I come into the room and I go, Tim, why didn't you ship anything this week? And you're like, well, we were working on the thing that you did made not scale. And, you know, there's just an argument. It's not a useful question to then go, could we make an investment to pay down some of this tech debt today so that we can reap those benefits tomorrow? That's a real conversation we should really have, which I think goes to one of the other topics we wrote an article about. But if you're not having those conversations in a meaningful and transparent way, it all just gets hidden or pushed under the rug, or, you know, you don't want to bring it up and then it doesn't get addressed.
Yeah, I find that the text is really important, right? The invisible text, sometimes this is very hidden, right? Sometimes the management and the product maybe only see about the features that is coming out. But sometimes you do have a lot of these issues. Maybe sometimes people call it developer experience these days, right? So I think highlighting that, making people aware that such thing exists is also very important. And I think I find that service disruptions most of the time is related to tech debt, right? So engineers will say, yeah, it's a tech debt. You know, we did it in a shortcut way and now we have to pay it back, right? So talking about tech debt will be never ending. But from your view, what are the typical tech debt things that people should really think about? And what are the warning signs?
The warning signs, well, some of the warning signs is kind of what we talked about, right? Like development slowing down. That's certainly one. Some of it could be in the impact to the end user. But I think some of it's going to be harder to track. Unless you're really sort of tracking developer satisfaction, it can be problems like, you know, often we'd go to a client and there'll be some strange, unique system that they've created that everybody complains about, and perhaps it was not documented in a very good way, or some legacy or something, and those kind of things, like they really hurt, like onboarding can hurt maintenance, those kind of things. The other thing is kind of like it's about engineering satisfaction, because if a developer is kind of like complaining about tech debt and they have no autonomy or no ability to reduce that tech debt, then that's going to affect productivity, right? And you know, often a pragmatic developer understands that it's debt and it's something that we've taken on. But if there's no like conversation about it, or there's no light at the end of the tunnel, if you know what I mean, it's when it can become an issue. And that's when it's probably like imbalanced in that sort of product engineering balance, right? Maybe leaning more towards the sales team or the product team is sort of making all the decisions.
One of the things, to go a little bit back to the conversation we had about reliability as well, right? Oftentimes, a lot of that time you could spend on paying down tech debt is spent on just keeping the lights on, right? That's often a good signal that it's time to invest a little bit more, because, you know, you can buy that time back and buy that scale in the future, and it's worth taking the time now to pay down that debt a little bit. The other thing Tim mentioned briefly, but I think is really, really helpful, is to think about onboarding, right? And to use onboarding as a moment to really identify some of that stuff. Like if you're successful and lucky in scaling, you're often hiring, right? And there's new folks coming in frequently. And those new folks, asking them and setting an expectation that they be sensitive to the weird things in your systems, and both pragmatic about like what can be fixed and what can't be fixed, but sensitive to the weird stuff in the systems, right, is really helpful because, you only get those new eyes once. And it's a really good time to say, you get that new person, they go, this is really weird. And you go, this is weird. I hadn't noticed because we've been living with it for 3 years now, but this is weird. You're right. We should do something about it, right? And that new person is often able to see that in a way that the people who've been around for a while just don't anymore. You just look right past it. The same way that, you got a pile of whatever in your house and you just, your eyes just skip right over it. You don't even notice. So yeah, having those new people and asking them, making it part of the onboarding actually to kind of identify some of those things and identify things that they don't understand or they think are strange so that you can use that as a feedback loop is really helpful. The other part of that I think is just, and Tim, you can probably speak as to how to create this better than I can, but there's a certain like quality of work or pride of work thing that becomes important in this space as well. And I think this goes back to the satisfaction thing. Like there's that pride of work. And if you're able to instill that, it creates a lot of value of almost like camping, this idea of cleaning up after yourself while you're camping, leaving it cleaner than you found it when you're refactoring, that kind of stuff, right? And making those decisions and taking that, again, this goes back to this idea of, little things you do every day. Taking that 5 minutes to do something as you're going rather than leaving it off is really, really valuable as well. One of the things that I do a lot as a product manager is often set a budget where basically that's the team's carte blanche to spend on tech debt, and specifically usually tech debt that is impacting their day-to-day, their quality of life, making things weird, making things annoying. Oftentimes, to your point about a unified roadmap before, if there's larger technical initiatives or larger kind of infrastructure, reliability, whatever initiatives that you need to make, that should come in on a unified roadmap. But there's also this budget of just like, this variable is named 6 different things in 6 different places, and we should probably get some consistency here so it's not confusing. I'm sure actual developers on this call can give me better examples, but that's just one that drives me crazy sometimes. But yeah, and setting that budget I think is really helpful. And that budget should be negotiable as well, right? Like if there's a big crunch time, we need to turn that to 0 right now, that's fine. But what's the payback period? I've even seen like the Basecamp 37 Signals folks, they tend to do a pattern where they'll do, I want to say it's 6 weeks of like the feature side, and then they have 2 weeks of like hardening and that. And so they fit that budget that way, right? But finding that way to do that time and do that cycling back and that cleanup is really helpful. And kind of framing it that way is like, hey, engineering leaders, this is your place to make decisions. And hopefully the engineering leaders are devolving that to the team too, so they can, Tim's point, clean up after themselves and do that stuff that makes them proud of their work.
I do think that sometimes tech debt isn't a very useful term because I think while it's sort of a good analogy and that kind of thing, it becomes this sort of amorphous blob of stuff. And it's just like, and the product team's like, why can't the engineers go faster? It's like, oh, tech debt, and it's like, really, you should be describing what are actually in the backlog, and the product team should take time to actually understand it. And the tech team should take time to explain it as well. But if you're just like this sort of like, if there's just this list of tech debt that the product team doesn't understand, then you can't have that negotiation kind of thing. Sometimes not very helpful. You just gotta be careful not to just bucket everything, because a lot of the stuff that we see in tech debt backlogs really isn't. A lot of things will actually affect a customer's experience. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, and I think sometimes the term debt implies that why did you make the debt in the first place, right? But we forgot actually during that context when we make that shortcut or decision, right? We actually wanted to get the product market fit or experiment, do quick things as much as possible, right? Another thing that I find part of the tech debt is the ownership, right? As the team grows, there are so many aspects of the system, it grows larger and larger, but somehow there are some parts of the systems which are ownerless. So maybe from your view, how can we have the ownership problem also tackled as we grow larger and larger?
Yeah, you nailed it, right? Like it can be difficult at the beginning, right? Because you sort of have this small team that everybody owns everything. And probably at the beginning, you may have like an individual would probably build something. But I think it's important as you scale that you understand your technical landscape and everything has an owner. Yeah. That is probably something we'd also say is sort of non-negotiable, that kind of like making sure that everything has an owner and is assigned to someone and someone's aware of it, even if they're not working on it, right?
And then this goes back to that, pride of ownership, pride of work thing, right? Like you care about things you own and you care less about things you don't own, and just having that ownership and also having engineering leadership that checks in, right? And just says, hey, how's this thing? going. And if you say, hey, I haven't looked at that in months because it's not important, okay, that's a discussion we can have. But like actually following up on and making sure that the people who are owning it are actually owning it and not just have their name next to it on a sheet of paper somewhere and are actually kind of doing the things you need to do to really own something. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. It's interesting, this conversation. It takes me back to kind of, forgive me everyone if you've heard this before, but like the original metaphor of tech debt, right? Where the term comes from is this idea of, in the same way that, I took out a mortgage to buy my apartment, right? Like that debt allowed me to do a thing I wouldn't otherwise be able to do, but I do have to pay that down. And if I don't pay it down, the bank's going to take my house. And it's this balance of making some decisions right now to get some leverage when you wouldn't otherwise be able to get that leverage, which, especially as a scale up is really, really critical, but also not getting so over leveraged that the smallest issue blows everything up, or that, you're spending your entire paycheck on debt service instead of actually saving some money or, investing in things for the future. And so I think that metaphor is still really great and really strong for the conversation. I think to Tim's point, just calling everything tech debt and just throwing your hands away is not really helpful, but that metaphor is actually a really useful frame to have conversations about this stuff.
Yeah, so I think it's been a great talk about the product engineering friction, right? The service disruption and tech debt. They are all interrelated, I find, right? So you cannot just separate these three things. Maybe if we can go, just now we mentioned about onboarding, right? So that is also one aspect of the bottlenecks that you mentioned in your series, onboarding, and also having to hire a lot of people. Maybe a little bit here, what is your tips to actually give to people about onboarding and also hiring?
I'll go one really quickly, and then Tim, you think about this more than I do. You can probably take more time. But the last step of the onboarding checklist should be to provide feedback on the onboarding checklist. So for the next person, it's better. Anyway, that's my one little thing that I think is a really helpful little tip, which goes back to retrospectives and everything else. But anyway.
Well, so yeah, I have been thinking about it quite a lot. And so in the article, right, we have this kind of like optimal onboarding timeline. And of course, it's a very extreme example. It's extreme, but it's based on real world experience. Like we've worked for companies that had amazing onboarding experiences. And I do believe that those companies can pivot quickly, can scale up faster. So, I mean, one of the things we often think about when we think about onboarding is like, it's kind of given a short shift because it's treated as like the new hire orientation. The point we make in the article is that no, it's actually a key business capability. It can drive a lot of your scale. But yeah, just a few tips, right? Is deploying on your first day, having a workstation, having your dev environment set up and good to go. There's a couple of things. I actually just saw some research from Microsoft about this because they were noticing that people that deployed early actually were more productive in their career. They did this correlation. And they thought it was because, they must have done like a story early and got into like learning the domain and all that kind of thing. But actually what it was is more they were doing a trivial change. And it was because they were able to talk the language of the team. I recommend doing a trivial change on the first day just to make sure your environment's set up. And then you start to understand all the different systems and those kind of things. A lot of the onboarding thing is like, the way to think about it is I'm not really improving. I am improving onboarding, but I'm also improving the developer experience and effectiveness of the team. And a lot of the things that you'll improve because the things that a new developer will find hard, probably developers are also finding hard, but not to the same extreme, right? Because like if you improve knowledge, if you improve the developer experience, the friction, the communication tools, so it's going to improve for everyone. So it's not right just to think about it of like an onboarding or a new hire orientation. It's really improving the effectiveness of the whole team like this way. And then, most of it, I mean, beyond the sort of technical aspects, a lot of it is about building that ability to collaborate and to quickly getting to know your team, work with your team, getting to know your cross-functional counterparts. So some of those things that we have in our checklist is just really understanding what is the company mission, what are the business goals, actually talking to a leader to present that, having an OKR, those kind of things.
I mean, one thing I'll say, especially for the product folks listening to this, like at one of the Scaleups I worked at, right, I was the head of product, and I personally did the business context onboarding for every single new hire far after you would think I would have stopped doing that, because I found it incredibly valuable. Like to Tim's point, right? If I can spend an hour of my time, hour and a half, 90 minutes, I think is what we usually did, and increase this person's effectiveness by 10% over the course of the time they work here, that's an incredible return on investment, even though, yes, I know it's hard for me to find 90 minutes a lot of the time. And so, yeah, I made that a priority and just did it a lot of the time because it's really, 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 really valuable to make sure people understand and can ask those questions. They can ask those questions from someone who has a more holistic view, right? Having more senior folks do that. And then your team can onboard you into your team context, but getting that holistic view so you can understand what's happening outside of your team context is really helpful. Which again, I think goes back to this idea of onboarding as well. And this idea of onboarding as not being just for the person who is being onboarded, but also for everybody, and also kind of building up this corpus and this set of things that is most important for the new person, but is helpful for everyone. Those onboarding documents are often so helpful for adjacent teams who need to understand about what you're doing, who are new to collaborating with you, right? That onboarding happens constantly, especially as you grow about, oh, we haven't really worked with that team, but we need to integrate with them for this thing or that thing, or we need to collaborate them to ship this feature or whatever. It's much, much easier to do that if you can go look at their docs on Stoplight, if you can go read the business context behind what they're doing in Confluence, not to name products, but like if you can go read those things and then go to the conversation rather than showing up and going, so I hear you guys are the contracts team. What does that mean? Like that's such a wildly different experience to showing up and knowing what the software does, knowing what it does today, knowing what they think their goals are, knowing what their roadmap is in the near future, right? That makes it such a different conversation. And that's helpful for onboarding, but it's helpful for everyone, or, onboarding into these other things as you go and onboarding across the business. And the other thing too is like Scaleups change so fast that a team you thought you knew what they were doing 6 months ago or a year ago is completely different now, right? Even if it has the same name. And again, that being able to re-onboard yourself or reorient yourself into what your colleagues are doing, it's very, very helpful. And using onboarding of new hires, which is, a critical moment as a lens or a forcing function to improve all of that, I think is really key.
Yeah, I like the point where you mentioned onboarding is not just for the new joiner, right? It can also be an investment for everyone, including the developer experience, right? And I like the final checklist that you have that you mentioned in the beginning, Kennedy. Like always try to give feedback to the onboarding process so that you can have the next person enjoying the benefit of the improvement, right? So I think we covered a lot today. Obviously, we can't cover everything, all the bottlenecks. I'd like to probably wrap up here and ask you one last question, which I always ask to all my guests, which I call the 3 technical leadership wisdom. I leave it up to you how to arrange the answers. But if you can share some of these advice, what would that be?
Okay, so I was thinking about, you asked this earlier, I've been thinking about it. So one thing that's interesting, because I run into this quite a bit, right? When we talk about knowledge and sort of collaboration and that kind of stuff, and a lot of times it comes down to documentation. One of the things that I think is the best way, especially for a junior developer, to kind of learn is via observation. And when you document something, you write down what you think is important, but actually what might be really important is, how the shortcuts, how does someone arrange their tabs, these things. So I think, especially with onboarding, like having opportunities for developers to observe other developers, especially senior developers, is incredibly important, whether that's through pair programming, mob programming, those kind of things.
It's not just for developers. This is a thing I get into a lot too. It's like pairing as product people, pairing as designers is really, really valuable too. In the same way, right? How you navigate through problems, how you navigate through finding information, seeing those things. And to Tim's point, like the stuff you write down is not necessarily, you write down the stuff that you think is important, but that's not really, oftentimes, the stuff that you do every day is often the more valuable stuff, and you just don't even think about it because it's so automatic. One thing I'll add to this list, just really reflecting on the conversation we've been having, is that a lot of these things that we talk about, they're not big initiatives, they're not big efforts, and they aren't successful if they are big efforts. It's stuff you show up and do every day. It's those little things that you do every day that add up to success, right? Making sure that you're paying down tech debt every so often, making sure that you are showing up and thinking about and taking the time to think about how the work you're going to is going to impact the overall goals of the organization. Not lying to yourself about the impact of the things you want to do because you want to do them, right? All that, it's simple, but it's hard. And that's the stuff that's surprisingly valuable and surprisingly difficult. But it's also one of the things that I find heartening about that is because it's simple but difficult, anyone has access to it, right? It's not this thing that you need to be a genius to do. It's just a thing you need to have the commitment and the discipline, the showing up every day to give a shit to do it.
I think, particularly if we're talking about scale-ups, so of course, right, you may have some exotic, complex technology that should be in the core feature of your system. Everything else should just be simple. Like, what's the simplest way that I can build whatever supporting systems I need and not waste any time on it and put all your energies into that complex things? And I know as an engineer, you get excited about solving a problem or creating a rules engine or whatever it is, right? But like, ideally you can use a third party or something, but if you can't, how can we do it in the most simple way and still scalable, but just because I think these sort of complex or applications that are over complex in places that it doesn't need to be is a big one.
No, I agree with that. We'll make that number 3 because one of the best pieces of advice I got when I started my first company was startups don't starve, they drown. Right? The thing that will kill you is a lack of focus, not focusing too hard in one place and not being successful in that place, right? You obviously have to, again, stay honest with yourself and pivot when you need to, but you can't pivot if you're not going in a direction, right? That's not what pivoting means. If you're just spinning, it doesn't matter. If you're just trying to do everything all at once, it doesn't matter. And so to Tim's point, focus on what the core is, what the thing that's really the value you're creating, make everything else as simple as possible. Just don't worry about it.
Yep. Thanks for the plug, right? So I think I love all the wisdom, definitely. So if people want to continue this conversation or they want to reach out to you, ask you questions, is there a place where they can find you online?
LinkedIn.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I am on the application formerly known as Twitter too, it's Kennedy Collins, first name, last name. This is probably the best places, yeah.
So thank you again for your time today. I really learned a lot, and I hope the listeners here also learn a lot about the challenges in a scale-up, right? And hopefully you get some gist on what to do next in order to tackle those bottlenecks. So thanks again.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.